Welcome to the Maritime Noon phone-in. I'm Costas Halavrezos. You have to keep a close eye on your banking information because you make yourself vulnerable every time you swipe your banking or credit card. And what about web shopping or social networking? Today, call with your questions about protecting your private information. Just a few years ago, we would have never thought of showing the world those silly photos of ourselves lying on a beach imbibing fruity-colored drinks and clowning for the camera. But social networking websites like Facebook now make sharing those pictures with everyone commonplace. Well, we choose to do that for better or worse. But what about using ATMs or credit cards in stores? Well, our guest today is David Fraser. He's a privacy lawyer with the Halifax Law Office of McInnes Cooper. He also runs the Canadian Privacy Law blog, which deals with issues from copyright protection to banking security and scandalous Facebook photos, which might limit your career. And despite being an expert in privacy, he's not immune to the evils of information theft himself. As he'll tell us in a few moments, he just last week had someone steal his banking information. But he joins me in our Halifax studio to provide advice for you. If you have any questions about how to protect your private information, call now. 1-800-565-1940. That's 1-800-565-1940. In the Halifax area, 420-9336. The lines are open for you now if you'd like some advice about protecting your private information. David, welcome to Maritime Noon.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So what happened? Tell us about what you're not happy about recently.
Well, I guess it's part of a question of I don't know exactly what happened. The part that I do know is that I got a telephone call first thing in the morning from my bank. This was just last week. Saying that they suspected some fraudulent activity on my bank card, asked me whether I'd withdrawn a certain sum of money the day before, which I hadn't, and they strongly suggested going down to my bank branch and getting a new bank card. And what transpired was, or at least the information they were able to get, and I was extremely impressed with how quickly they were able to act, was that sometime in the evening, the day before, somebody had gone to a bank machine, one of these generic, unbranded bank machines, and had withdrawn $400 from my bank account. And the bank was able to detect that it wasn't part of my normal modus operandi, the sort of thing that I usually do, or they might have been able to correlate it with other complaints of fraud. And they were able to detect it within the space of a couple hours. Canceled my card so that whoever was using it or was using a copy of it was not able to do that anymore. I reached into my wallet. My bank card was there. It hadn't left my wallet all day. But somehow somebody had gotten a copy of the magnetic stripe on it, had made themselves a new bank card, also somehow got their hands on my PIN, and was able to start going to town with it.
Now, how do you do that? What do we know is out there to say, copy a magnetic stripe, the data on a magnetic stripe?
Sure. My understanding of how it happens, or how it can happen, and I guess that there are a couple of ways. One is skimming, which is the process of, let's say you hand a clerk your bank card. They skim it through the normal terminal, but then they also skim it through a hidden device, which actually for $50, and you can buy all the gear off of eBay or a whole bunch of other different places, you can record the information that's from the stripe. And then you can take that information and record it onto a new card. And so you do have a duplicate of the card. One of the big impediments is actually the PIN number. And the people who are involved in these sorts of scams are really quite clever. In some cases, they do something called shoulder surfing, which is where they try to observe you entering your PIN number. Although I'm relatively paranoid, I can't imagine that I do look around and I cover up the PIN pad. But in other cases, they're done with hidden cameras. That camera technology these days is so small it's hard to detect. Other circumstances we've heard in the news in the last little while of people going into retail stores and trying to distract the clerk to actually steal the PIN pad from a bank machine terminal. And what they do is that they then take it away and they put in some sort of recording device that records the magnetic stripe but also records the PIN number. And so that just records all the information that goes through it in the run of a day. Then they have to go back and try to steal it back to get that information back. And so it's a multi-step process, and it's not surprising that a whole bunch of people get caught doing that because the people doing it are relatively vulnerable. But those are what I understand to be the two most common ways that people get that information. And once you have that information, it's easy to duplicate, and then somebody just needs to go to a bank machine and try to take out the money.
But it sounds as if even if you're fairly cautious, you're quite helpless against someone who is that devious and who has that kind of technology at hand.
Oh, I think so, and I think that, as I said, I'm relatively paranoid about these sorts of things because part of my job is trying to keep on top of these sorts of things that happen with people's personal information. So I'm very mindful of this. One thing that people should be cautious for is to see whether they can detect whether a clerk is double swiping. In other cases, people have used bank machines and have put a separate facade on them with a very small reader so that you're just going to use a bank machine. It looks like a normal bank machine and it's being swiped. In terms of the things you can do to protect yourself, I thought I was relatively well protected by being paranoid about these things and taking a look at pin pads and things like that before using them. The number one protection in this case, and what saved me, was my bank. That I was extremely impressed that within the space of overnight, they had detected what they thought was fraudulent. It turned out to be absolutely correct, and they were able to take steps immediately to fix it. I'm not liable for those for that debit that was taken from my account, and so I can continue on my life and continue being paranoid, and maybe a little bit more. But I'm happy that somebody else had my back as well.
Okay, the phone lines are open if you'd like to call for some advice on how to protect your personal information when you're banking, when you're using credit cards, debit cards, or when you're shopping on the web. 1-800-565-1940 is the toll-free line. That's 1-800-565-1940. In the Halifax area, 420-9336. Just to pick up on that last point you made, and that is that you're not liable for the money that this person took out using your card. The bank is, and as we heard in the news today, apparently it's been adding up because some of the banks are lowering the limit of withdrawal on your bank card.
Yeah, and I think that the banks have for some time, and the credit card companies even longer before they were even debit cards. They take a significant amount of responsibility for it, or at least whether or not they legally need to. It's an important part of their customer relations. If they want to encourage their customers to use these devices, they don't want the liability for fraud to discourage them from doing that. And so that means that the banks have a very strong incentive to try to build in as much security as possible to make it as user friendly as possible, but also relatively secure. I understand one of the ways that they're doing that is to limit the amount of cash that can be taken out in any particular day, which seems to be a very sensible thing to do in light of the fact that with credit card fraud, people are often going and purchasing things because you can't easily go and get a cash advance from a credit card in the same way that you can with a debit card. But with debit cards, they're as good as cash. And so when somebody does manufacture or clone another card, what it is that they're doing is they're looking to get out as much cash as possible, as quickly as possible, and before it's detected.
Okay, let's go to the phone lines. Those numbers again, 1-800-565-1940 in Halifax, 420-9336. Our first caller is Robert in Tantallon. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. Your question.
I just have a question about, I guess it's a similar topic, but the whole identity theft. What you may think of purchasing into insurance companies to protect against the identity theft?
I've certainly become aware of a number of these products out there, and it seems to be that you want to take a pretty close look at what it is that they have to offer. Perhaps even a little additional background is just to talk about what identity theft is, distinct from the sort of debit card fraud that we've just been discussing. Identity theft is when somebody gets enough information about you in order to be able to impersonate you. And so they can once they've done that, they can fill out credit card applications in your name with a different address or otherwise. And so they're essentially creating accounts that you don't know anything about that wouldn't even show up if you're looking at your ordinary statement.
Yeah.
And the cost to repair identity theft depends on essentially how long it goes undetected, but it can be very expensive. In many cases, you're not liable for expenses and for debts that were assumed in your name that you're not responsible for. But it still takes a lot of time and effort to go, and you have to fill out affidavits. You have to provide evidence that, yes, that wasn't in fact you who opened this credit card account and otherwise. And so it makes sense, and we're seeing it increasingly as a rider or an option on your homeowner's insurance.
Yeah, and that's what I just went through. They offered it to me as an extra, and it seems to be a bigger issue, so I took it. But just in terms of the banks usually do cover, like you said, when you had your debit card number stolen, they did cover it, and you weren't liable for it. So I'm just wondering the worth of it, but it sounds like it might be worthwhile.
Do you remember how much extra you had to pay on the premium?
I believe it is about $5 extra a month.
Okay, so $60 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's like just about any insurance product. You need to factor in what are the risks and what would the cost be in order to deal with it if you didn't have insurance.
And for me, $60 for the year was worthwhile to have peace of mind that I don't need to incur all those lawyer fees if it ever does happen, I guess.
Well, that's right. Yeah, and it likely does make sense because the cost you'd be spending a whole lot of your time trying to chase this down. You'd be dealing with lawyers and swearing affidavits and things like that. If given at least all the information we're hearing from the RCMP and otherwise, that identity theft is a significant problem and it's growing quite rapidly, and so the risk of it happening seems to be increasing. And so if you can get yourself some peace of mind and that expenditure makes sense to you, then your best hope is that you really don't have to use it, and Absolutely. It's just you're only paying for peace of mind.
Okay.
Thanks for calling.
Yep.
You can call now for advice on how to protect personal information when you're banking, using credit cards, or shopping on the web. 1-800-565-1940 is the toll-free line anywhere in the Maritimes. 1-800-565-1940. In the Halifax area, we have a few lines open, 420-9336. Our next caller is Lawrence in Fall River. Hi.
Hello.
Yes, very well.
Great,
Good.
Thanks.
I have a suggestion for security for your credit card.
Oh, yes.
We go away for a few months at a time nowadays down south, and what we do is we phone Visa a couple of days before we go, and we explain to them where we're going to be, what states or provinces we're going to be in, and how long we're going to be gone. And they are very appreciative of that because that alerts them. They put that on our file in the computer system, however they do it. And therefore, if an odd use of our credit card or whatever card, debit card comes up, they know right away that that's not done where we're supposed to be. And they actually will alert us and call us. And in the last couple of years, we've had 2 such calls from them, just like your guest mentioned earlier, that they call us and say, look, we have this unusual purchase somewhere, and did you make it, or did you authorize it, or so on and so forth. And that's been very, very helpful once they've canceled our card because of it. And this spring they called also and said that they'd had compromised cards in a store where our card had been used within the same day. Our card hadn't been compromised, but others had, and just in case ours was, they canceled ours as well and issued another one.
Was this the big winners fiasco?
No.
Another fiasco.
No, it wasn't this. It was a store down south this year.
Okay.
Yeah, down in Alabama, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and but we find has been very, very helpful. My wife used to work for one of the banks, and as a result, we knew that this was something that they used to do. And so I would just advise anybody, when you're traveling anywhere, call ahead and tell them where and when you're going, and they'll keep a watch on your purchases.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you entirely. I think it's a very good practice, and it's a good practice for a couple reasons. One of them is exactly as you described. The banks use very sophisticated technology to understand what your normal transactions look like. Mm-hmm. And so if they see something that seems out of the ordinary, that's flagged and brought to their attention, and they take a closer look at it. And I've heard of situations where, for example, a person who doesn't often travel they go for a trip to Europe. and they all of a sudden their credit card doesn't work.
That's right.
And the reason for that is that their credit card company thinks that this is a very unusual transaction. Sometimes it could be a very large. For example, they're staying in a hotel for a week, and all of a sudden there's a $2,400 charge or something that appears.
Yep.
And so they'll cancel the card, and you can find yourself in a situation where you're not traveling with a big pocket full of cash. You're relying on your credit cards, and those have been canceled.
Travel with the card rather than cash these days.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and fewer people are using traveler's checks like they used to.
That's something I would suggest people to. We had some people visiting us down south this spring using American Express traveler's checks, and we could not cash them in about 10 places that we tried, and about 6 or 7 of those places were actually banks in the United States, and they would not cash the traveler's checks.
Yep. Yeah,
it's just too much of a risk, they said.
Well, thank you very much for calling in.
Okay, bye-bye.
1-800-565-1940, toll-free, and in the Halifax area, 420-9336. And I know of a case very similar to the one that Lawrence just mentioned, a friend who was traveling in England, but of course, I suspect very often there is a time lag. Some expenditures showed up on his credit card a few weeks after he left.
Oh, really?
And it took a while, of course, before the credit card company could contact him to check that out.
Yeah, and they really do make an effort to get to know you. But if you've had a string of transactions in England and that were fine, that they would think that the subsequent ones are probably fine, or some things that hadn't fully gone through and were just being re-registered. Another good reason to call them is to give them your cell phone number, because if they notice something, they might only have your home phone number on record, and you're not there to answer it. But if you've got your cell phone number with you, or if they have your cell phone number and you have it with you, then they can reach you wherever you are.
Okay, call now if you'd like some advice on how to protect personal information when you're banking, using a debit card, a credit card, or shopping on the Internet. 1-800-565-1940, toll-free in the Halifax area, 420-9336. Now, at the beginning of the hour, I did drop the word Facebook, and I thought for a while, I remember years ago, there was a lot of talk, and I remember doing interviews with people about the importance of not divulging too much personal information on the Internet. And it was generally directed first at adults, then at children who were rather naively going on and giving on way too much information about themselves. And that seemed to be going well, that educational effort. And then Facebook came along. And now the lid seems to have completely come off that. What's your take on that?
I find the whole phenomenon to be very interesting. Because I certainly was a part of discussions about, well, when you're on the Internet, you want to limit how much information you're putting out there. You want to be extra concerned. You never know who's going to see that information. You never know what's going to happen. And then all of a sudden, we have this whole next generation of what they call Web 2.0, all these websites that are devoted to entirely disclosing personal information and sharing personal information and exchanging it with others. And so it represents this monumental sort of sea change, and it's a generational thing as well, because it really took off with university students. Facebook was first an application at Harvard University, and then it grew like wildfire. And what's interesting is that I think it represents, it's just simply a new technology to encourage relationships, that sort of information that people were otherwise sharing, and has grown to include a wider circle of friends. And one can have really a lot of control over the information that's being shared and kind of who that information is going to.
But that takes some maintenance.
It does.
I understand.
It does.
I'm not on Facebook, by the way.
Yeah, well, the default settings are sharing that information relatively widely. And I think those websites are very useful and very interesting. And I'm on Facebook, and I've reconnected with people from junior high and things like that. And I find that interesting. But I'm also aware of, and I'm the kind of person who's going to be taking a close look at the privacy policy and the privacy settings on those sites. The problem with them is that the default settings are really quite open. And that they appeal very strongly to young people who don't seem to have the same issues about personal privacy that us older folk do. And for for kind of from the outside looking in, it's a bit shocking in a number of ways.
How so?
Well, in the amount of information that's being shared, the sort of information that you probably, even if somebody had taken a picture of you at a party, you might not have wanted necessarily circulated around your friends. All of a sudden, a large number of young people are posting these pictures on Facebook, and they're being made available very broadly. And one of the problems with putting information on the internet is the persistence of that information. That something you do that you think is really cool when you're 14 might be somewhat less cool when you're 18, and could be monumentally embarrassing when you're 25 in the job market and looking for a job.
And it's still just hanging out there.
And it's hanging out there. Although many of these sites, for example, Facebook, you can go after the fact and remove pictures and untag yourself. It takes an effort. It would be nice to see them so that you could do it with one click.
Okay, let's move on to our next caller, Cecilia in Halifax. Hi.
Oh, hello.
Yes.
I have a question for your guest.
Sure.
We lived in Mexico for many years, and we were in a small town, and I looked at my Visa bill on the internet, and there were about $800 of fraudulent charges in BC and Alberta, and one was a taxi. Now, how did they get my husband's Visa card number?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
There are a number of different ways that can happen. One of the challenges is, and I know that many people in Canada were involved, for example, when the Winners TJX incident happened.
This was before Winners.
Right, but I'm just using that as an example of this sort of thing. And a lot of retailers hang on to that information. Mm-hmm. So any place that you've used your card in the last while, that information might remain on record. And retailers shouldn't be hanging on to it that long, but I think the practice at least has been to hold on to it for a significant amount of time. And so that means that if the information is compromised there, that information can then be subsequently used somewhere else. And there can be a very long lag of time between when you last used your card at that establishment and it being compromised. But the thing to do is, as soon as anything like that comes to your attention, contact your issuing bank for your credit card.
Which we did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of the really good things that's very consumer friendly about this, I talked previously about how they're looking out for fraudulent charges. Well, they're also, if you report something to them, they'll act very quickly. They have full fraud departments and internal investigation departments, and they'll go after it. And so you really don't have to concern yourself with the logistics of really trying to find out what happened or what went wrong. You have the peace of mind in knowing that as long as you're looking at your bills and are reporting suspicious transactions as quickly as is reasonable, that becomes their problem and not yours.
The interesting thing is we hadn't been to Alberta in 15 years, although we had been to BC like 2 years before this occurred. I just found it very strange. Sure,
and one of the things that's really scary and eye-opening, and most people don't get to see this side of things, is that there are people, hackers or whatever you want to call them, who trade on almost a wholesale basis on compromised credit card information. And so they will, and your credit card number and expiry date is really only worth $5 to them. They sell them in such large quantities. And so that means that your card might have been compromised in Ontario or Nova Scotia, but it can be picked up by somebody in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, or, to use your example, British Columbia or Alberta.
Okay, I understand.
Well, thank you for calling.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
1-800-565-1940, toll-free anywhere in the Maritimes, and in the Halifax area, 420-9336. Our next caller to Maritime Noon is Barb in the Annapolis Valley. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you.
Good. I'm just wondering, when you go to a store and you use your bank card, how much information can they get off that bank card? And they ask for your phone number. And even if you're paying cash or whatever, is it not against the privacy law now to give your phone number?
They can't really require you to provide information that's not necessary for the transaction. So if there isn't a reasonable purpose for them to call you after the transaction, they shouldn't be asking you in the first place. Or if they are asking you, they should be making it clear that it's optional.
Yes, they say it's for because if you have to return something.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of controversy over how much information that retailers should be asking for. Particularly in preparation for a return. It's a different matter, for example, if you go to a store, and I think many retailers have this practice, if you go to return an item and you don't have a receipt for it, they'll ask for information, for example, a driver's license. But it's differently. I think it's different to preemptively or proactively collect information in anticipation of returns. And I think a lot of consumers are in a position that they are able to say, no, I don't need to provide you with this information. You don't need it for the transaction.
Okay, no, that's right. But can they get any information from your bank card itself?
No, the information that's encoded on your bank card is largely the information that's printed on your bank card. So it's a series of numbers. There are some additional codes on the magnetic stripe so that they can confirm that the card, in fact, was present, which is why in order to rip off somebody or clone somebody's debit card, pretty well you need to have a copy of the magnetic stripe on it. But to my knowledge, it doesn't include any bank account information. Your PIN code is certainly not encoded on your card, and it doesn't include anything like your phone number or anything else like that.
So there is no personal information taken off the machine when you use your bank card?
No, just the number from the card, which can be personal information in and of itself, but there isn't anything in addition to that.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thanks for calling. You're listening to Maritime Noon in St. John at 91.3 FM, Halifax at 90.5, Charlottetown at 96.1, and Moncton at 106.1 FM. My guest today is David Fraser, a privacy lawyer with the Halifax Law Office of McInnes Cooper. He also runs the Canadian Privacy Law blog, which deals with issues from copyright protection to banking security and dubious Facebook photos that float out there for years and years. We're inviting you to call in if you'd like some advice on how to protect personal information when you're banking or using credit cards or shopping on the web. 1-800-565-1940 is the toll-free line. In the Halifax area, 420-9336. We'll return to your calls after this news update with Dan Page. Dan.
Thanks, Costas. Here's some stories we're following around the Maritimes today. 2 people are dead and 6 others are recovering from injuries after a crash on the Trans-Canada Highway near Moncton overnight. It happened just after midnight. A 47-year-old man and a 17-year-old girl, both from Moncton, died when their car collided with another vehicle. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Charlottetown is no longer under a diversion order. It was lifted this morning after a number of patients in emergency were cleared to go home. The order was imposed yesterday, and patients were sent to other hospitals because of too few beds. And the Nova Scotia Justice Department says it will provide training and appropriate weapons for corrections officers who escort prisoners on trips outside of jails. The decision follows an order from the Provincial Labour Department. Guards will be allowed to use so-called intermediate weapons such as pepper spray and batons, but not tasers and not guns. The weather for the Maritimes is issued by Environment Canada. In New Brunswick today in the north, a mix of sun and clouds, some scattered showers this afternoon, isolated thunder showers as well, a high of 23 to 26, while in southern New Brunswick, a mix of sun and cloud, a high of 24, except 21 along the Fundy coast. In Nova Scotia, a mix of sun and cloud today, some scattered showers isolated later this afternoon. Fog along the Atlantic coast, that's going to persist with a high of 24, except cooler at the coast. And in PEI, a mix of sun and cloud this afternoon, some scattered showers, also isolated thunder showers on the island with a high today of 23.
Thank you very much, Dan. And back to the phone lines on Maritime Noon. Our next caller is Amber in Halifax. Hello.
Hi.
Yes, your question.
Well, I'm planning to travel around Egypt for 2 months with my mother next January, and I'm just wondering, in case my card is canceled, is there any way to contact the bank online? Because I won't have my cell phone.
I'm not sure. What I would probably do is in preparation for your trip, I would probably contact your branch. And I would go in and tell them your situation and find out what it is that you should be doing. Because often, I think people who travel internationally sometimes have difficulty getting in touch with their bank because the number that might be printed on the back of your card or on your credit card or otherwise is a toll-free number that's often a challenge to dial from overseas. And there are other numbers that you can use that can do that.
But if you can get into an internet cafe in Cairo, let's say,
Right.
might it be easier to make contact that way?
It may be possible, and actually one thing that might not be generally known is that your bank manager has his or her own email address. And if you can tell them about your special circumstances and say that you're concerned about this, I wouldn't be surprised if they were to give you their personal email address and say, well, use this in case you have any issues, and we're happy to help. That banks are obviously, they're in the service business. Banks usually don't send out email messages because of all these phishing scams and stuff like that. But I expect your bank manager would be happy to hear from you that way.
Right. And would you recommend, because I've always avoided travelers' checks, and it'd be nice to avoid, the large wads of cash as well. Is that your opinion? Would you avoid travelers' checks?
Well, I would read a recent travel guide about where it is that you're intending to travel.
It looks like it's fairly difficult to catch them.
Well, and also the acceptance of credit cards differs from place to place, and there may be certain brands of credit cards that are more accepted than others. And so you're very wise to turn your mind to this question before you're going. And the good travel books should have information on that. And even if you need to, perhaps get in touch with a local bank, which you could likely find on the internet in the area that you're going to be traveling. Call them and ask them what their policy is in accepting traveler's checks. Do they prefer a certain brand of traveler's checks? There are some that are less prevalent in North America that are more common in Asia. For example, Thomas Cook. Asia and Africa, and it may be that your best bet is actually to get those in Europe on your way while you're in transit.
But if you're going to a bank in another country, you might be able to just get the cash out of there. I mean, I hear that you're not fussy about carrying much cash. On the other hand,
well, we're there for 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would like to not have to go to the bank so often.
Mm-hmm.
So balance that with not having thousands of dollars on us in Cairo.
Well, and depending on where it is that you're going, it's been a while since I was in Cairo. It's sometimes a real challenge to deal with local banks.
Oh yes.
And there's more foreign exchange places than there are banks, and for the major hotels are likely quite good at cashing travelers' checks. But again, it's worthwhile looking into it. If I was traveling kind of off the beaten track or for an extended period of time, I would carry with me a stash of cash. And I would keep it on my person, and I would keep it in a money belt or something else like that, because you never know. You might lose your wallet and your passport and everything else like that. And as long as you have enough money to get you to Cairo and in touch with the embassy there, or able to sort things out.
Right. Okay. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Happy traveling.
Thank you.
Our next caller is Norman in Prince Edward Island. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Good. I was traveling down to Florida last Christmas there, and our house we rented got broken into, and they took our wallets and stuff like that. And when we reported our credit cards missing, that was all good and fine. But they told us that we should contact, I think it's Equifax, and there's 2 other companies that you have to get a contact with for your identity theft and stuff like that.
Sure, yeah. Those are the what they call the consumer reporting agencies, or the credit bureaus.
Exactly. So I got a hold of one company, but when I was trying to get a hold of the other 2, it was like trying to get teeth out of a frog. Like, I still haven't gotten a hold of them. Like, you're put on hold for so long. Is there any easier way to get a hold of them?
This was last year that this happened?
Yeah, well, at Christmas time, just a week or 2 before Christmas.
Okay. The challenge might have come from the time of year. Although I would be persistent. The reason why they suggested getting in touch with them was it sounds like it wasn't just your bank cards that were taken, but also identification documents, and which can be used to commit identity theft, and not just your bank card fraud or your debit card fraud.
No, I realize that.
And so the reason to contact the consumer reporting agencies is so that what they do is they put a flag on the account, so that so that anybody else who runs a credit check will know to be extra careful that the person making the request for credit might in fact be an imposter. It is unfortunate that you had this challenge. Most of the consumer reporting agencies have offices in Canada and in a number of different municipalities, and you might be able to get the local information from their website or otherwise. And if you're really challenged, might want to contact your bank or contact the police and find out if they have alternate toll-free numbers or different ways of reaching them.
Okay, because I still haven't gotten a hold of the other two. I just got so frustrated trying to get a hold of them. But the first company was bang, right on, no problem getting in there. But the other two, you had to dial more numbers than you need to. So
no, and that's unfortunate. It really does add on to the frustration of having something like this happen.
Yeah. Well, thanks for calling.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Our next caller is John in Nova Scotia. Hello.
Hello, how you doing?
Very well. Your question.
Well, I'm just going to mention something that happened at the company that I work for, and I'll hang up, then you can respond to it. We do a lot of transactions, either by debit or by credit card.
Yes.
We had a gentleman come in about a week or so ago, and on the back of his card, instead of a signature, it said, ask for ID. And he mentioned that the police had told him to put that on there after he had his wallet stolen and some transactions went through on his credit card.
Mm-hmm.
And he had it on his credit card for about 6 months before he came to our store. And he said out of all the stores that he's gone to, I was the third person that asked him for ID when they saw the back of the card. Is that something that's allowed? And if so, is it, well, it must be a smart thing to do because you would have the picture ID to back up the name on the card.
Right.
So I'll just leave that with you and get your comment on it.
Well, David?
Sure. It's a practice that I've heard of before. And on one hand, it makes a lot of sense because your signature is only as good as your signature can be faked. And some people, it's easier to fake than others. And if it's backed up with photo ID that includes the photograph of the person and the name and things like that, you likely have a greater assurance that it is the person who's presenting that card. What's interesting is that the credit card issuers themselves don't want you to do that. And they discourage the practice. They want the signature to be the signature on the back of it. And actually they discourage retailers to demand photo ID from individuals.
Really?
And I think the concern is that simply slows down transactions. And also if the person, and maybe it also has to do with the ability to confirm a signature on their card rather than a signature on a driver's license compared to what's on the sales slip. One thing that I have noticed is that on some of my cards, the signature kind of rubs off. I guess I'm not using the right kind of pen. That when you mentioned that only 3 people had asked this individual for ID, I'm seeing increasingly that retailers are educating their cashiers to actually take a look at the signatures. And this is a relatively new phenomenon, at least in my experience, and are asking for ID if they can't read the signature, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, thank you very much for calling in. Our next caller is George in Borden, Prince Edward Island. Hi.
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, a few years ago, I guess it'd be 3, maybe more, I had $1,000 removed from a line of credit that I had with a bank. And they phoned me up and told me about this abnormal transaction. And I told them, no, I didn't do any business that way. Anyway, I had to go in and get all my credit cards changed and passwords and that sort of thing. But after that, I continually got emails telling me to update my PayPal account, which I don't have. And it just doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense.
I was going to ask David, might that be just plain phishing, what they call phishing?
I think so. I'm not sure whether the two would necessarily be related. One of the most prevalent scams, and it's amazing that it still works. But I guess if you get one person out of 1,000 who goes for it, you're in business if you're a fraudster, which is to do something called phishing, which is to send people email messages that suggest, for example, the security of their PayPal account or their bank account or otherwise has been compromised. And so they're preying on people's fears about their privacy in order to get them to click on a link that takes them to a site or website that looks like an official PayPal or bank website.
They're getting better,
but really
they're better than they were about 2 years ago.
Well, that's right. They are getting more sophisticated. And so what it is that they're doing is they're asking you to confirm your identity by putting in your bank card number and your PIN number or otherwise. then they're taking that information and they're committing fraud. And a PayPal account is the same sort of thing. It is similar to a bank account. They can receive money into that, and they can take money out of it. What we're seeing more recently is something called spear phishing, which is it's a more spear phishing, which because it's a more sophisticated, targeted type of phishing. So they find out a little bit about somebody. And so they think, for example, they might be more likely to be a customer of a particular bank, and they send them these sorts of emails, and so it's targeted to that individual, or related to a particular profession. My email address is on the website of the law firm that I work at, so anybody who wants to go looking around can see that I'm a lawyer, and so I do routinely, and I've heard this from other lawyers, get phishing emails that are directed at lawyers, that are pretty clearly directed at lawyers. So somebody is taking the time, rather than just having a list of millions of email addresses, of trying to be a little bit more refined. Because obviously the more that the more a fraudster knows about you, the more they can play off those vulnerabilities and make things look familiar. So the best thing to do is PayPal will almost never contact you by email in order to do something like that. Your bank will never send you an email message to tell you something like that. It's always by letter mail, and it always comes in an envelope. And so always be extremely wary of any sort of unsolicited email message. And so, for example, if you do get something and it looks like it's from your bank, don't click on a link in it. Don't reply to that email. Pick up the phone and call your branch. And that's always the best thing to do. Or if you think that maybe something had happened and this is an official communication from PayPal, go to the PayPal website yourself, get their customer support number, or go to the customer comment page and paste that email in and ask, look, is this legitimate? And it's only once that it's been confirmed as legitimate, which is likely not, that you should act on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I never answer these letters anyway, these emails.
Yep.
And as I said, I don't have an account anyway with PayPal, so.
Yep, so that would be the first sign.
Yeah, so I just ignore them, but they've been coming now for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Oh yeah, they're extremely aggravating, and they're making up a significant portion of the email that people receive on a daily basis.
Well, thank you for calling.
Okay, thanks.
Bye. Our next caller is Pascal in Eastern Passage, Nova Scotia. Hello.
Hello, how you doing?
Very well, thanks.
Hello.
Good. One thing that happened to me a few years ago is my electric bill got shut off. And one of the reasons why is that there was somebody else who was moving that had an address similar to mine, and there was a mistake done, and we got our power shut off instead of whoever was moving. And what we've done now is put password on every account that we have, whether it's bill, it's phone, any kinds of bills, phone, electric, even our bank's account now. If we call to access anything, they ask for a password.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good practice. Another good practice with passwords is to make sure that you're using a different password for every service that you're using, particularly online, which can be a real conundrum. It can be a real challenge because so many people have multiple accounts. They have their banking. They might check their power bill online, and so you can come up with systems to help you remember them. But it's important to have a different one on each one, because if one is compromised, you don't want that master password to compromise all of your different accounts.
That's right.
So yeah, passwords are important, but diversity of passwords is equally important. That's a good idea.
Okay.
Thanks for calling.
Thank you. Bye.
Our next caller is Julie in the Annapolis Valley. Hello.
Oh, hello, Costas.
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a few points, particularly for the woman who was going to be doing some travel internationally.
Oh, yes.
A few months ago, my husband and I did a circuit around the globe, and so we took our credit cards, we took bank cards, and we took traveler's checks. The most valuable two items out of the three were the credit cards and the bank cards. The traveler's checks I essentially came home with. And the reason being, we found that very few places were willing to accept them. And even exchange bureaus in towns, like in downtown Tel Aviv, for example, or in Hobart, Tasmania, or various other destinations where we were, they didn't want to accept them. Yes, they were American Express, and we had taken them in American currency.
Now, we heard a similar story from someone who'd been traveling in the United States and who told us even the banks, some banks, would not take the traveler's checks.
Well, I'm hoping I can use them in the States when I next travel there because, anyway, we'll see what happens. But with the credit card, yes, we did give the advance notice, as others have mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
We gave them the itinerary. And they also gave us just the number you could call and place a call collect. So there was a 519 area code, I think, for the MasterCard number, and I forget what it was for the Visa number. But we went armed with these in case we had any difficulties. They would accept a collect call. One other thing, we found that using the bank card just to get cash out in whatever country we were in
Yes.
Was very easy. We, of course, made sure that the machine was tied in with a reputable bank and did have the appropriate symbols, the Interact symbol or other ones that were appropriate for our cards. And that was a very simple way of getting out just the amount that you needed, particularly if you were leaving a country in a day or so and you just needed, a few dollars or a few $100s to get you through.
David Fraser.
No, I think those are really good ideas. One thing that I've noticed is in international airports, I've seen bank machines that will dispense in multiple currencies.
Oh, really?
And which is very handy. And one thing that's worth thinking about or inquiring about before you go is how the exchange rates are calculated. Because in some cases you might be at a disadvantage if you're using a credit card compared to using a debit card and otherwise, and always be mindful of service charges that you might incur. But no, at least from what I've heard recently, I think that credit cards and debit cards are among the most useful. If you're traveling into less developed countries, you might be very challenged in using a debit card. But most major hotels, no matter where you go, are going to be set up to take credit cards.
Well, thank you very much for calling.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Our next caller is Phyllis in Moncton. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, your question.
I didn't really have a question. That was to comment on we always think that we're very unique and our pattern isn't so predictable. And yet our lifestyle, the way we live it, we have a tendency to live in patterns. And, for example, my sister's a teacher, and she didn't realize her Visa card had been stolen. And one day she came home from school at 4:30, and there was a phone message to call us. And so they said, did you use your card this afternoon at 2 o'clock? It's such an unusual pattern for you. She said, no. Well, they said, do you have your card? Yes. Well, I think so. So she went and looked. She didn't have it. And they said, well, it looks like they tried to see if it would work, and they bought something for $2, and then they went on a little spree, so we canceled the card. She said, oh, my gosh. And indeed, you don't stop and think. If you're in school every day from 8:30 to 4:30, then your card is never used at that time period.
But the bank software was thinking.
Yes. And so our patterns are more predictable than we think we are. And the banks recognize that. So I think we don't always say they do a good job. But
I never use my credit card between 12 and 2.
Yeah. But, it is interesting from that perspective that they're that precise.
Well, and I think also, interestingly, is that they know your patterns, but they also know what to expect outside those patterns.
Yes.
In that you might, for example, if you're never using your bank card, let's say between noon and 2, even Costas has to take a vacation, and so if they know that for example it's used in Toronto and then it's used in Winnipeg. During those times, and it kind of fits in with his previous patterns. Maybe that's then they know it's not problematic.
Exactly. I've used mine from one day, one province, another province, but I phoned them first and said, I'm going to be here, so don't be surprised. But if it comes in Moncton, then it's a shock, that kind of thing. But certainly when you travel, it is very important to check with them and let them know where you're going. We found that when we went to the Scandinavian countries, we had no problem there at all with bank cards. Even in Russia, we used Visa and bank card.
Okay, well, thank you for calling.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
David, one thing we didn't touch on, and this actually emerged last year with one of the major grocery chains, and that is the plain old paper hard copy receipt. If you use a credit card, some of them print out your entire number.
Yep.
and some do not. They'll put a bunch of X's and maybe just the last 4 numbers. Is there any move in industry to move towards that, where that to leave less information lying around on a piece of paper?
Yeah. No, absolutely. There are 2 things that are pushing in that direction. The first is a privacy law that we have that applies to all retail establishments in Canada, or variations of the law that require that information be safeguarded. And if you're printing the full credit card number on a slip, where the consumer can lose it or the cashier can lose it or things like that,
or use it,
that's right. And so that's not safeguarding the information. But connected to that, and for similar reasons, the credit card issuers have a policy that credit card machines shall not, and this is their rule. It shall not print the whole number on the slip. And one of the challenges has been some of the old pieces of equipment aren't necessarily up to the new standards. And so my understanding is that as the people who roll out these debit card machines and credit card machines, the newer ones will truncate that information. Because the alternative is, in order to use somebody's credit card, all you need, particularly for what's called a card not present transaction, which is, for example, online, you need their full credit card number and the expiry date, which is often printed on some of those slips.
And then there's that other number on the back.
Yep, some credit card transactions, and increasingly they're using this. It's a special, usually a 3 or 4 digit code that's used for card not present transactions. That's not recorded on the, or only a variation of that is recorded on the strip. And so what that means is that it's an additional proof that whoever is presenting that number actually has the card physically there. What we're seeing is, and Europe is already there, and North America is getting there, is credit cards and debit cards that don't use a magnetic stripe but use an embedded chip, and instead of relying on a signature, rely on a PIN number. And so your card will never leave your hand. You put it into a reader and you put in a PIN number, and so there isn't the same kind of number of digits and the same sort of vulnerability associated with that. They're continuing to make things more secure, and the fact that the banks and the credit card issuers are the ones who are essentially having to take the losses means that they have the incentive to put in place additional security measures.
Okay. Our next caller is Christine in Halifax. Hi.
Hi there.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to speak on behalf of somebody who has had experience on the other side of the counter, the other side of the point of sale.
Yes.
It's not something that I work with anymore, but in the past I've experienced people who do become quite frustrated when, their signature might be rubbed off and you ask them for a piece of ID, or even, have experienced people being frustrated when it says right there on their credit card to ask for ID, and then you do. It's like it's an inconvenience, and it takes time out of their day, and I can appreciate that. We're all busy people, but I think people need to, especially now, be more aware and be appreciative that their cashiers, no matter where it may be, are taking the steps to ensure that this is the person using the right card, and have a little patience, because it's not meant to inconvenience you. It's meant to protect you.
Thank you for that note.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
You probably might not hear it often enough, but thank you for doing that.
And that is all the time we have for calls. David, thank you very much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
David Fraser is a privacy lawyer with the Halifax office of McInnes Cooper. He's also a privacy blogger, and you can find that at privacylawyer.ca/blog. That's privacylawyer.ca/blog. Coming up tomorrow, call with all your questions about bicycle maintenance, repair, and safety. I'm Costas Halvarezos. Have a great afternoon.